The death penalty is the harshest punishment for a dangerous criminal. In many modern countries, it was abolished long ago, but not in China. So what crimes can warrant such a severe punishment? Poisoning in a kindergarten, revenge that turned into tragedy. Traditionally, in this country, people are executed for crimes against individuals, murders, rapes, terrorist attacks. A high-profile case occurred just a few years ago. A kindergarten teacher, seeking revenge on a colleague over personal disagreements, poisoned food intended for the children. On March 27, 2019, everything was as usual at the Menmen Kindergarten in Jiaozuo City, Henan Province. According to the daily schedule, the children were served porridge for breakfast. However, in one of the groups, the little ones soon began to feel unwell after eating. The situation escalated quickly. The children were crying, complaining of stomach pain, and started vomiting. In total, 25 children were affected. The symptoms indicated a mass acute food poisoning. Representatives of the administration urgently called for medical personnel. Law enforcement agencies began an investigation, initially suspecting staff negligence, but the experts' conclusion stated someone had added a large dose of sodium nitrite to the porridge. Nitrite salt is used in the food industry as a color enhancer and preservative. However, in large doses, it has a toxic effect. The possibility of the substance accidentally getting into the porridge was immediately ruled out, and a few days later, law enforcement officers detained kindergarten teacher Wang Yun. She was accused of deliberately poisoning the children. The investigation established that a few days before the incident, Wang Yun had an argument with her colleague Kunmo over disagreements regarding teaching methods. Wang Yun decided that she could have the final say by poisoning Kunmo's students. On March 27, she put her plan into action. Doctors managed to save most of the children, but one of the pupils died several months later from the effects of the poisoning. This largely determined Wang Yun's fate, and on July 13, 2023, the sentence against the 39-year-old woman was carried out. The death penalty is applied to women in China quite actively. First and foremost, this concerns women found guilty of murdering minors with particular cruelty or those involved in drug trafficking. The murder of a taxi passenger, the high-profile Didi Chuxing case. The story of the Chinese taxi driver Zhong Yuan is also widely known. On August 24, 2018, a driver for Didi Chuxing, the country's largest online ride-hailing service, raped and murdered a 19-year-old female passenger in the Yueqing area. The killer drove her to a deserted place where, threatening her with a knife, he tied her hands and feet with tape he had prepared in advance. Later, the man used her mobile phone to transfer 9,000 yuan to his own account, which is roughly equivalent to 120,000 rubles, and then raped and killed the girl by slashing her throat with a knife. Before her death, the victim managed to text her friend, saying that the driver was taking her somewhere through a deserted mountainous area. She then sent a message asking for help. But unfortunately, that did not help. The girl never made contact again. The man was quickly found and apprehended. He immediately confessed to what he had done and showed where he had hidden the body. The man was executed on August 30, 2018. Before his death, he was allowed to see his family. After such a high-profile incident, the authorities organized an inspection of all similar Chinese services and also tightened the requirements for drivers registering in the system. At the same time, the company Didi Chuxing ceased providing its services. Crimes against children, pedophilia, and public outcry. It is not uncommon for very young girls and children to become victims of maniacs. For example, among other things, the level of crimes related to pedophilia is quite high in China. In recent years, at least 7,000 such cases have been recorded. But the most high-profile and large-scale crime occurred in 2015. At that time, a provincial school teacher was executed. He worked with elementary school students and over the course of 1 year molested and raped at least 26 girls between the ages of 4 and 11. The elderly Li Jinshun specifically chose as his victims shy girls from poor families whose parents had left to work in big cities. He raped the children right in the classrooms or in the dormitories. And, unlike other cases where the death penalty was applied, this time Chinese society unanimously supported the sentence. Some internet users even expressed regret that an ordinary execution was too humane a punishment for such a criminal. Nevertheless, Jinshun's death was more of an exception, since most pedophiles in China get off with only long prison sentences. For example, there is the well-known story of a Colombian teacher. A foreigner named Daniel was working part-time at one of the private schools in Qingdao. According to surveillance camera footage, the man was harassing a child. He entered the bedroom where the children were sleeping and put his hands under the blanket of one girl. For about a minute. This happened when the Chinese caretaker had stepped out to use the restroom. Daniel was detained a few days later, but the sentence he received was not particularly harsh. The man received only a few years in prison. Terrorism in Xinjiang. Attacks and mass executions. On May 22, 2014, two cars sped into a crowd of people in the administrative center of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the city of Urumqi. A traffic accident? An unfortunate incident? No, it was a planned terrorist attack. One car exploded, and from the other, an explosive device was thrown outside. 39 people died as a result of this disaster, and another 90 sustained injuries of varying severity. In the same region, in October 2013, an SUV drove onto a bridge near the main entrance to the Gugong Museum complex and crashed into a barrier behind which pedestrians were standing. As a result of the accident, 7 people were killed and another 38 were injured. And the very first terrorist attack occurred on April 30th at a railway station. As a result, 3 people died and another 79 were injured. In total, over the entire existence of the criminal group, at least 150 people have died due to terrorist actions, and more than 400 have been injured. The victims included both civilians and military personnel. So, which group are we talking about? In the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, in addition to the titular Han Chinese nationality, there are also Muslim Uyghurs living there. All of the aforementioned terrorist acts were attributed to members and accomplices of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. The organization did not deny its involvement in what had been done. 13 people were executed in 2015. They were involved in 7 incidents that took place in the region. In addition, the Chinese authorities announced a reward for information about planned crimes. The struggle for peace in this region is still ongoing. The death penalty for drugs. Foreigners in the crosshairs of the law. But most often in China, executions are carried out not for crimes against people, but for drug trafficking. And if you think that as a foreign citizen this definitely won't affect you, you're deeply mistaken. After all, it is necessary to obey the laws of the country you are in. In the PRC, smuggling, selling, transporting, or producing more than 1 kilogram of opium, as well as more than 50 grams of methamphetamine or heroin, is punishable by the death penalty or life imprisonment, which may be commuted to a prison term of more than 15 years. For example, in 2019, a Beijing court sentenced a South Korean national to death by lethal injection. The man had been detained back in 2014 on suspicion of selling 5 kilograms of methamphetamine. However, the case dragged on for a long time because the South Korean authorities insisted on a more lenient sentence for their citizen, requesting that the verdict be reviewed or its execution postponed on humanitarian grounds. But this did not save the offender. The sentence was still carried out. And this was already the 6th South Korean to be executed in China. One person received a death sentence in 2004 for murder, while the others were also convicted for drug trafficking in 2001 and 2014. A Canadian and 220 kilograms of methamphetamine. The path from appeal to execution. A high-profile case involving the same offense also occurred in 2014. At that time, Canadian citizen Lloyd Schellenberg was caught by Chinese authorities for trafficking methamphetamine in especially large quantities. He was found guilty of smuggling a total of 220 kilograms of this substance. During the trial, the man was provided with a lawyer and an interpreter, and initially he managed to receive the most lenient punishment provided by Chinese law, 15 years of imprisonment. But the verdict did not satisfy the Canadian. Schellenberg, insisting on his innocence, filed an appeal, and then the court in the city of Dalian not only rejected it, but on the contrary, toughened the sentence, imposing the death penalty. The trial lasted more than 5 years. And over these years, new details about the case emerged. The verdict drew condemnation from Canada, the United States, and the Netherlands. We urge China to grant clemency to Lloyd Schellenberg. We strongly oppose this cruel and atypical punishment for legal practice, said Canada's ambassador to China, Dominic Barton. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also commented, "We are deeply concerned that China is allowing arbitrariness in issuing the death penalty, especially with regard to a Canadian citizen. Chinese drug cartel. Internal fight against trafficking." After the previously described cases, one might get the impression that only foreigners here receive the highest degree of punishment for drug trafficking. However, that is not the case at all. In 2017, the Chinese police busted a group involved in large-scale production and distribution of drugs. All 7 members of the gang citizens of the PRC received their punishment. The leader of the group, Chen Chuhong, and another drug dealer were sentenced to death, while 2 more members of the group were sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve. As a rule, a death sentence with a reprieve means exemption from execution. If the defendant does not commit a new crime during this period, the death penalty may be commuted to life imprisonment or a lesser term. The remaining members of the gang received various prison sentences ranging from 2 to 10 years of imprisonment. The gang mentioned in the Xinhua news agency report had been selling methamphetamine for 2 years, distributing about 33 kilograms of the substance since May 2014. Thus, drug trafficking is one of the most common reasons for which a death sentence may be imposed. The authorities of the PRC take a strict approach to the production and distribution of illegal substances within their country. Execution, often public, is a way to show criminals the level of responsibility for such activities. Corruption and execution. The Tigers and Flies campaign. In addition to drugs, the Chinese authorities are actively fighting corruption. They consider it one of the main obstacles to achieving their key development goals. The nationwide campaign Fight Against Tigers and Flies was launched in 2012 by the country's leader Xi Jinping. The program has achieved impressive numbers. In 2019 alone, at least 254 zero officials were held accountable for corruption and disciplinary violations. Let's talk about the most interesting cases. In 2009, the former head of Beijing Capital International Airport, Li Peiyin, was sentenced to death. From January 1995 to November 2003, Li served as Assistant General Director, President, and General Manager of Capital Airports Holding, as well as Chairman of the Board of Beijing Airport. He was found guilty of accepting bribes from affiliated parties in exchange for assisting with unauthorized investments and providing guarantees for bank loans. Through his illegal activities, Li embezzled at least 82.5 million yuan from the company between 2000 and 2003. The Shandong court stated that the amount of money involved in Li's case was exceptionally large and caused significant economic damage to the country. However, the man returned all the illegally obtained funds to the state and requested a review of his sentence. But none of the courts, including the Supreme Court, agreed to reduce his punishment. The man was executed in August 2009. Billionaire Liu Han. Mafia, money, and the death sentence. The case of a Chinese billionaire from the Forbes list is also widely known. Liu Han was ranked 148th among the richest people in China. At that time, his fortune was estimated at $855 million. He headed the private mining company Hanlong, based in Sichuan province, and in 2011 launched a takeover deal worth more than $1 billion for the Australian firm Sundance. But the deal fell through in 2013. That same year, reports appeared in the Chinese media that Liu Han had been detained. Together with 3 accomplices, he was sentenced to death for organizing and leading a mafia group, as well as for murder and other crimes, illegal arms trafficking, extortion, and so on. In total, Liu Han's group consisted of 37 people. The prosecution claimed that Liu had formed the gang back in 1993, and during the group's existence, its members committed a huge number of crimes, including 9 murders. According to law enforcement agencies, the group took illegal control of several sectors of the local economy, earning enormous profits and seriously disrupting economic and social order. The billionaire behind bars admitted in his testimony that he had pursued aggressive business tactics but denied the charges brought against him, insisting that they were fabricated for political reasons. Liu Han received the death sentence with tears in his eyes. A financial pyramid with ants absurdity and execution. Another case related to fraud is also of interest. It's an old one from 2011, but it definitely deserves your attention. An enterprising businessman, Wang Zhengdong, decided to set up a financial pyramid against the backdrop of rising incomes among Chinese citizens. He sold his investors kits for breeding ants. But don't jump to conclusions just yet. In traditional Chinese medicine, ants are widely used. For example, ants can be added to tea and beverages as a natural remedy for illnesses. But it's not the unusual product that makes the company organized by Wang Zhengdong fraudulent. The point is the scheme invented by this man had all the hallmarks of a financial pyramid. And of course, only the very first investors could make money from it. The rest had to settle for the ants. From 2002 to 2005, the company managed to attract at least 10,000 gullible Chinese people. According to agreements with the producers, some invested in production, while others started breeding ants themselves in their own yards. However, the payment of dividends soon came to an end, while the ants continued to multiply at an extraordinary rate. By the time the police got involved, it was already too late. Of the $300 million earned by Wang Zhengdong, almost nothing remained. The founder of the fraudulent scheme and his accomplices had spent everything on luxury goods. More than 10,000 investors lost their savings. Mass protests began. The businessman was arrested in June 2005. Given the public danger posed by the crime, the court sentenced Wang Zhengdong to death and his 15 accomplices to prison terms ranging from 5 to 10 years. According to the verdict, Wang Zhengdong's property was confiscated and used to pay off the investors' debts. The death penalty as a deterrent. The list of offenses presented shows that in China, as a rule, only the most high-profile and brutal crimes are punished by execution. And despite the fact that this punishment is still used in the land of the rising sun, the number of death sentences here is decreasing every year. What do you think? Should the death penalty be abolished worldwide? Thank you for watching.